You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. We got past Thanksgiving. We're past the first week in December, and now Christmas is almost here.
And then we can get Christmas over with, so my birthday month
begins.
begins.
Yeah. Those that haven't listened, they're going to figure out real quickly that you celebrate your birthday for the entire month.
Of January, yes, every year.
Whereas I don't even really like to even celebrate my birthday, so, you know.
Yeah, but you get the 4th of July, so there's enough celebrating happening around your birthday as it is.
I always tease and say that the entire country celebrates for my birthday. But anyhow, today's an interesting topic, and it's mold in crawl spaces. So right before we even started recording, what did I say about crawl spaces?
Oh, you don't like them.
I hate them.
Yeah.
And I'm sure most of our listeners hate them, but doing mold remediation in them, I never thought I was claustrophobic, but sometimes, depending on the crawl space, they're not fun to be in.
Well, and especially I would think older homes, right? Like I think new homes give you more room in crawl spaces than homes built 1910, 1920.
Oh, of course. Yeah, the older homes are like army crawl spaces, and we can't even do mold remediation in those types of crawl spaces. But for the most part, like you said, it's a 4-foot foundation, and usually the whole crawl space is dug out, so we have the head height is plenty, but it's still not fun at all.
And I think most people ignore their crawl spaces for the most part because they don't want to go down in them either.
Exactly. They're full of snakes, which I hate, and spiders and mice and all sorts of stuff. So
wait, there are snakes in crawl spaces?
In the older, we're talking more, usually I would see those, when I did home inspections, we would see those like in mobile homes.
Oh, that's crazy.
You'd see rabbits and all sorts
rabbits.
of stuff. That was actually, like I just said, my biggest fear is snakes, and I got certified as a home inspector, 20-something years ago. But my biggest fear has always been coming across the snake in a crawl space where it's army crawl. It's not like you could turn around and run. It's not fun. Yeah,
so that's why most homeowners don't go into their crawl spaces.
So for our listeners, there are two different types of crawl spaces. There's conditioned and unconditioned. Do you know what the difference is? It's pretty simple, actually.
No, I mean they're all dark and ugly and dirty.
Oh, okay.
So what is the difference?
So a conditioned crawl space is completely sealed up, and more or less it's similar to the temperature in the house, whereas unconditioned's not. Meaning the biggest difference would be, in my opinion, is for a conditioned crawl space, there isn't passive ventilation, meaning just vents in the foundation. It's actually, there is no ventilation except for like a dehumidifier or an ERV system, which is air that blows around in there, versus unconditioned would have passive ventilation and all that.
So when you put the plastic down, is that a conditioned crawl space or is that an unconditioned?
You can do it in both.
Oh, so the
plastic wouldn't determine whether it's conditioned or not conditioned.
So ventilation is what determines whether it's conditioned?
If it's part of the ventilation system as far as the HVAC system.
Oh, okay. But what about on houses that don't have HVAC? Can you still have a conditioned crawl space?
I wouldn't. I mean, you could, but it would not make a whole lot of sense.
Okay.
But I guess my point is a conditioned crawl space is way better than an unconditioned. Now, each has its pros and its cons, and we're not going to get deep into that, but that's, in my opinion, a conditioned crawl space is better. As far as throwing a vapor barrier down, you can do that either way, and you should, no matter if your crawl space is conditioned or unconditioned, you should have a vapor barrier down, period.
So do you think most homes have conditioned crawl spaces or unconditioned?
No. By definition, conditioned would mean that you're heating the crawl space like you would the rest of the house.
Okay, then. Okay.
Does that make sense?
So if somebody's thinking about building a new house, should they ask for a conditioned crawl space?
I wouldn't.
Oh.
I mean, but once again, it all depends on what your contractor's calling conditioned or unconditioned.
Okay.
By definition, for a contractor, that means you have registers in your crawl space.
Oh, okay.
Because you're heating that.
Okay, got it.
So I personally wouldn't. I wouldn't want a HVAC unit, meaning the furnace, the air handler, and I've seen these all the time. I wouldn't want all that stuff in a crawl space.
Okay, so which is better at preventing a toxic mold issue? A condition. Oh, yeah. but you said that you wouldn't.
But I wouldn't want to share the airspace.
Ah, okay, I see.
That's why.
Okay.
It's more or less I think you're asking for more problems with a conditioned versus an unconditioned.
So then if somebody has an unconditioned crawl space, which most people do, and it's not sharing airspace, what are your recommendations for preventing mold in the crawl space?
Well, either way, in a crawl space, you've got to monitor the humidity, period.
Okay.
And like I said, an ERV, which is energy recovery system, which to me is more like a ventilation system. They have all different acronyms and names. But let's just say, so kind of back up from what your question is. If we were building a brand new home in Wyoming or Utah or out west, where you're at geographically and what the relative humidity is where you live would probably have a lot to do with how I would build it.
Okay.
So if you're building a cabin that you're only going to be in the summer, I'd definitely go unconditioned.
Okay.
If you're going to build a cabin that's in the mountains and you go there all winter, you might start looking at, okay, should we have conditioned, unconditioned? And for our listeners, at the end of the day, we don't want to get hung up on whether it's conditioned or unconditioned. To me, you're comparing apples to oranges, and I can't from this microphone determine or tell somebody in Florida what they should be doing.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
But there are some pretty standard ways that in general, no matter what the type of crawl space you have, you could prevent mold.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And those would be a vapor barrier.
Okay.
Vapor barriers, depending on the type of system you put in. There are companies out there that it's high quality work. I don't want to diminish that, but it's expensive. They'll run that vapor barrier all the way up the foundation, part way up the foundation, maybe only over the dirt. They'll put that dehumidifier in there. Let's say if it's in a humid area, the ERV system. I mean, there's a lot of factors you have to consider.
Okay.
And when you're deciding what you're going to do, once again, water table really matters, geographic location.
And what is water table?
How much water's in the soil.
And do most people know their water table, do you think?
Well, I would hope. I mean,
I don't know that that's the case, but this is a note to everybody. If you don't know your water table, I don't know how you find out, but find out.
Well, you have test holes, I guess my point is if you're digging your foundation, so I'll just give you a few scenarios. So that big project we were doing up outside of Jackson, they have a very high water table. For the most part, before all these places were built out there, it looked like it was kind of just farmland. Mm-hmm. When they dug their foundation, like when I was there to do mold issues, their hole, so for our listeners, they dug the hole for the foundation, they had poured the footings, it was full of water. that means you have a high water table.
But how would somebody who's just buying an existing home know their water table?
I mean, I guess I just make assumptions that people would know. Like, you should know if you're buying in what used to be the swamps or if it's a higher elevation and there's no water runoff issues.
I think a lot of people don't know. And I think a lot of people now in the age of where people are buying homes without home inspections, you know, we have that whole phenomenon of just wanting to get the house. I think a lot of people don't know their water table.
Huh. Well, I mean, as a home inspector, I could tell, or a mold inspector, you know, when you're doing the inspection and there's, you know, 3 or 4 sump pump systems, the water table's high. If there aren't any, once again, you can't just assume, but I would assume that the water table's not high. But knowing what the water table, there's a ton of factors. What type of soils are they? Mm-hmm. Where is it? Like, is it next to the river? Is it next to a lake? I mean, there's a lot of factors. Is it irrigation? Like, did a farmer or rancher sell off 100 acres to subdivide? And that was their low area of their pasture where all the water sat? Like, and I guess that's why I just assume people should know that, but maybe they don't. I don't know.
And that's a really good tip for people who are just hearing this and they're like, I didn't even know what a water table was. That's a great tip that you should, if you don't know, you should find out.
Yeah, I mean, the easy way, like if you dug a hole, for our listeners, if you dug a hole with a piece of equipment, you go down 4 feet and it's full of water, you have a high water table.
Okay.
If you go down 8 feet and there's no water, you have low water table.
Interesting. That's good to know.
So, yeah, I guess I just assumed people knew what their water table is. But anyhow, it just depends on where you're at and all of that.
So then they know their water table, which would then tell them which of the mold prevention measures they need to take in their crawl space.
Yeah, if you have a high water table, I would assume you're going to have a drain tile system, sump pumps. You're going to have engineered measures in place to get rid of the water.
Okay.
And that's another factor. You've got to get, like putting a sump pump in a crawl space and then piping it to the exterior. If you're dumping the water right outside the foundation, you're just recycling the water. Mm-hmm. And remember, you know, there was a job in Pinedale I went and looked at. And remember, it was in a trust.
Oh, yeah, because the river? Was it the river?
Yeah, it was right across from the Green River.
Yes, yeah.
And remember, it was, the head height was small. Like, I bid it really, really high because I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
But remember, that situation was they put a sump pump in there years ago. The home was probably 40 years old. But they piped it right to the exterior, right outside the foundation. Well, the water just kept recirculating. And I guess that's my point. Like, throwing a sump pump in there is not going to overall fix the water issues.
Absolutely.
You've got to get it piped to somewhere that the water's going to run away.
Absolutely.
Makes sense?
So it does make sense. So literally, I mean, crawl space, proper ventilation, humidity gauges, so you're always monitoring when the humidity is going higher than it should be going, a vapor barrier, that plastic that people put down, a dehumidifier. But what happens if somebody who hasn't been checking in on their crawl space all of a sudden realizes they have a mold issue in their crawl space? What happens then?
Well, we got to figure out what caused it.
Okay.
That's the most important thing. For C&C contractor services, we won't even do remediation on anything, whether it's a crawl space, attic, basement, until you have fixed the defect that led to it.
Correct, because it'll just happen again.
Exactly.
Okay.
And naturally, you know, the homeowner's like, well, Steve came in and they remediated all this mold and now it's back. Well, if you didn't fix what caused it, then it's going to keep coming back. But going back to your question, like, is the crawl space or the home 5 years old, 50 years old? Like, if you ignored something, so going back to the property we were just talking about that was in town, right across from the river, that was an old home, and there were chronic moisture intrusion concerns. So, I mean, literally, there were sections of the subfloor and floor joists that were black because it had gone on for so long.
Yeah. So, that was, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess my point is for our listeners, like, it's something you've got to pay attention to. Whether you're buying a home that's 5 years old, brand new, or 50 years old, you've got to pay attention to the crawl space, just like you have to with the attic and everything else in your home.
Well, absolutely. But what can somebody expect who's got a mold issue in a crawl space and they're like, we have to remediate this? They fix the defect, but what should they be expecting in terms of how the remediation is going to go in a crawl space?
Well, it's going to be really expensive.
Oh, okay.
Because if you think about a crawl space, and once again, there's a bunch of different factors. Is there insulation in between the floor joists? If there's not, there's tons of factors to consider. But if you think about a crawl space, so for our listeners, you're in a crawl space, you're laying on your back on top of the dirt, you're looking up, you're going to see the floor joist. If there's insulation, there's going to be insulation between it. And then once you remove that, then you're going to see the subfloor. So if you think of a floor joist and then in between it, your subfloor, think about all the mold you'd be seeing. We literally have to go in and abrasively remove all of that.
Okay.
And you can dry ice blast, you can baking soda blast. We sand, because that's, in my opinion, the easiest cleanup. But imagine having to sand every floor joist. And when you think of one floor joist, you see 3 different sides to it. Mm-hmm. The bottom, the left side, the right side. Can you imagine having to sand all that?
No.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, yeah.
And that's why I hate working in a crawl space.
Yeah.
It's a pain.
Absolutely.
And so to answer your question, for our listeners, I don't want to freak them out. It just depends. Like, is the entire crawl space contaminated? I mean, if so, it's a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. So then, given that, what's your call to action for people?
We just talked about it. Go down in your crawl space.
Okay.
And do an inspection.
How often should they be doing a crawl space?
Spring and fall.
Okay. So with the fall and spring checklist.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, it'll be a while. We just did the fall, I don't know, a month or so ago. But go inspect it. And for the listeners that are like, I'm like Steve, I hate bugs and snakes and all that, hire someone. But at least, every crawl space is different. Some are accessed from inside the home. Some are outside. Just at least go pull the cover and look with your flashlight.
Yeah. If
you look down in there and there's a bunch of standing water, it's probably not good.
Oh, yeah.
So it's very important. And for our listeners, it's going to cost you a lot of money if you don't pay attention to it.
So pay attention.
Exactly. And we have digital products. How many do we have? 2, I think, right now?
Yes.
We have the Mold 101.
And the mycotoxin prevention kit.
Exactly.
Right? Yep.
Which is, we sell those quite often.
Yeah.
So, but for our listeners, I'm not sure, how much is the mycotoxin prevention kit? $29?
$29, yeah. And it has so much education in it.
Yep. You can go right to the website. I'll put a link in the podcast description, but for our listeners, go purchase that. What you can explain how it takes up to a couple days to get it.
Oh, well, absolutely. Go to cnccontractorservices.com, click on the mycotoxin prevention kit, sign up for it, and within a day or 2, you'll start to get the email access to all of the content for the prevention kit.
Yeah. And I guess my point is they don't get everything in one day.
Yes, it's released over a number of days.
But it's like 3 days or 4 days.
Exactly. So
perfect. All right. Well, go to our website and make sure you purchase one. I appreciate all you listeners. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.